This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision video for Paper 1 Psychopathology with a specific focus on the definitions of abnormality. To get started, let's have a look at where definitions of abnormality fit into the bigger picture on the specification. So there are 4 definitions of abnormality, and they are the first bullet point on the specification. They include deviation from social norms, failure to function adequately, statistical infrequency, and deviation from ideal mental health. So these are the 4 definitions that the exam board expect you to be able to recognise, describe, apply, and evaluate. So we're going to go in order of the specification in this video, starting with deviation from social norms, moving on to failure to function adequately, then statistical infrequency, and finishing with deviation from ideal mental health. So to begin, let's have a look at deviation from social norms. This is an opportunity for you to pause the video and have a think, jot down any ideas on how this definition defines abnormality, and in 5 seconds we will go through them. So, deviation from social norms defines abnormality in terms of individuals who go against social norms. What we mean by social norms are those unwritten rules that are unwritten in society for what is acceptable behaviour. For example, not being naked in public. Other unwritten rules might be not talking to yourself as you're walking down the street. That might be a deviation from social norms. So abnormal behaviour in that context is any behaviour which goes against these social norms. It goes against these expected or acceptable forms of behaviour. So this definition makes a distinction between desirable and undesirable behaviour. That is your AO1 for deviation from social norms. Of course, you can add detail by coming up with your own examples of social norms and any deviation and linking that to why a person is abnormal. But if you would like to pause the video to consider some strengths and weaknesses of this definition, I'll go through them in 5 seconds. So we've got 3 evaluation points that we can use for this definition here. And the first one is cultural differences. So if you think about my example of being naked in public, of course, in a classroom in England, that would be considered abnormal for a teacher or for anyone to be naked in a public place. However, if I was on the beach or a swimming pool, not necessarily being fully naked, but being in a bikini or some form of swimwear, that would be considered acceptable. So there are cultural differences which affect this definition. Different cultures have different social norms, which means what is judged as normal in one culture might not be judged as normal in another, and therefore be judged as abnormal. So although my example of being naked in school or in a supermarket compared to a beach or a pool might help you to understand this definition, the sort of strongest example you could use in an exam to further your evaluation point on cultural differences is that of auditory hallucinations, which we cover in the schizophrenia topic for paper 3. That is a symptom of schizophrenia, something Western culture sees as abnormal. However, in other cultures, hearing voices is viewed positively, and this individual that is hearing voices or talking to themselves might be considered spiritually gifted. So this definition is therefore limited in the sense it's very hard to judge abnormality across all cultural contexts. And as we know in psychology, we like to be able to create universal definitions. So deviation from social norms does not fit that criteria of a universal definition. However, this definition certainly does have some practical applications when we're thinking about social norms, about how to behave in public or how to behave in different cultural and social contexts. Deviation from social norms is a useful definition, and it is used in clinical practice. So antisocial personality disorder is when an individual doesn't conform to culturally normal ethical behaviour. So they might be very deceitful, very manipulative, very aggressive, not able to sort of regulate their emotions in different contexts. Maybe a situation of road rage where someone who is considered normal would just beat their horn and maybe share a few choice words, whereas someone with a antisocial personality disorder is then likely to block the other car in, get out the car, smash their windows, scream and shout in their face, and take that very small situation of road rage and sort of catastrophize it and blow it out of proportion. Linking that to this definition then, these signs are all deviations from social norms. We know it's not acceptable to get out of a car and to intimidate people. It's socially unacceptable. There's unwritten rules and written rules in terms of the law around it. And these norms play a massive part in the diagnosis of many personality disorders. So this shows that this definition does have its value in psychiatry and clinical practice. The final evaluation point is the negative implications that this definition can have and has had in the past. So a really quite sad one. It's led to the abuse of human rights. So historically, people have been diagnosed with things that were used to maintain control over them. Homosexuality used to be considered a crime in some cultures, as did interracial marriages. But the specific example I've got here for you is drapetomania, which was used to define black slaves who attempted to run away from their slave owners. So this, of course, historically has been used to maintain control over slaves. These classifications now in present society appear ridiculous, and I'm sure we can all agree on how ridiculous drapetomania as a condition of abnormality is. However, that's only because our social norms have now changed. So regardless of the example being historical and no longer applicable to society, deviation from social norms could potentially have more negative implications in the future, and so it is just a bad definition for that reason alone, I would argue. Moving on now to failure to function adequately. If you would like to pause the video, I will go through the AO1 for failure to function adequately in 5 seconds. So, failure to function adequately defines abnormality if a person is unable to meet the demands of their everyday life. They might fail to meet standards of hygiene and nutrition. They might be unable to maintain relationships or remain employed. They are all examples of failing to function adequately. And this is because their behaviour is considered maladaptive. And if you break that word down, usually mal means like negative or not able to. So maladaptive meaning not able to adapt. They display dysfunctional behaviours. So different dysfunctional behaviours or characteristics of failure to function adequately include the absence of interpersonal rules. So they may struggle with maintaining eye contact, or they may be struggle to understand when to look away when maintaining eye contact, or respecting personal space. They would express severe personal distress, which affects themselves, things like self-harm or just, a negative attitude towards themselves. Also, observer distress, causing distress for those who observe their behaviour, so their carers or their friends or their family or just anyone that is in the presence of this person. They might cause them distress in terms of, sort of going back to my example of the road rage instance, that's observer distress for anyone who has to witness that. Their behaviour may become irrational or dangerous to themselves or others. So they might become very impulsive, they might climb onto a roof or dangle over the edge of a sort of motorway bridge, that sort of thing. And then lastly, unpredictable behaviour. So they may randomly start crying or laughing for no apparent reason, which of course then can link into your observer distress, which could cause distress for individuals witnessing that behaviour. So the key points for your AO1 here is that it's about an inability to meet the demands of everyday life, and that behaviour is maladaptive. So with that in mind, Now is your opportunity to pause the video. In 5 seconds, I will go through the strengths and weaknesses of failure to function adequately. So, we can compare between definitions to get some evaluation points. And so you could argue that failure to function adequately as a definition is better than deviation from social norms, for the reason that this takes account of the individual's own perspective, their subjective experience, rather than judging them based on society standards. So it's really important in psychology that the individual is considered. Rather than saying you are abnormal because you don't do what everybody else does, this definition focuses on the individual. So it can be considered a kinder and less judgmental definition of abnormality. It leads to a more sympathetic approach from the medical profession. And it's more likely to stay stable across time because it is about that individual and their own lives. So this is a really good definition because it can avoid the stigma often attached to mental illness, and it encourages the person to seek help and sort of address those areas in their life where they are failing to function adequately. However, a major weakness of this definition is that abnormality does not always lead to or is not always associated with dysfunction. So this definition assumes that to be abnormal, you are dysfunctional. However, psychopaths, and I've got the example of Harold Shipman here, psychopaths can cause great harm but still function normally. And psychopaths, people diagnosed with psychopathy often have really high IQ skills and are often in very high professional positions. So they're not dysfunctional. They appear to function normally, just like Harold Shipman, who was a serial killer, an English doctor who murdered over 215 patients. He was certainly abnormal in the sense that he's a serial killer, but he was a respectable doctor and he didn't appear to be dysfunctional. So abnormality cannot solely be defined by failing to function adequately. Failing to function adequately cannot explain all abnormality, such as that of psychopaths. And then finally, it's a limited definition because a person who has lost a loved one might not eat, they might not have the best hygiene, they might not go to work, they might be distressed, they might display all of those characteristics that we've looked at in the previous slide. But that does not make them abnormal because it is actually perfectly normal to suffer distress and to not be able to cope with everyday demands in life. So this makes it very difficult to assess when dysfunction should be considered abnormal. So you can use that word subjective here, and that we're saying it's a good thing because it's subjective about the individual. But in terms of a definition, its measurements, its assessments are very subjective, because how long is it normal to grieve for a loved one that's passed away? You can't really put a figure on that, and so we can argue that that element of it is subjective. The subjective assessments, though. So this means failure to function adequately is a limited definition of abnormality. Our third definition, which we will look at next, is statistical infrequency. So this is your opportunity to pause the video and jot down any AO1 you can think of for statistical infrequency, and in 5 seconds I will go through it. So statistical infrequency explains abnormality as an individual who has a less common characteristic than the rest of the population. So those behaviours which are numerically rare are considered abnormal. So this is a good definition in the sense that it's quite objective because it relies on numbers, it relies on percentages, statistics, standard deviation, etc. So you can use your knowledge of research methods here. So although we've only got sort of 2 pieces of AO1, less common characteristics and behaviours which are numerically rare, we use those, and it's really important we use that terminology to explain statistical infrequency. But we can also bring in our knowledge of the normal distribution curve from research methods. So what this shows is generally people will fall in the average here, sort of -2 to 2. So these numbers are to represent standard deviations. But if you just sort of explain, you've got your 95% of people. So the normal distribution curve applies to IQ, which I'll go through shortly. It applies to adult height, adult weight, adult shoe size, etc. So you may have people who are considered abnormal here if they've got a very small sized foot, but on the other end, people with very large feet are also considered abnormal. But 95% of people tend to fall in that average range. So if we take an adult woman, an adult female of an average shoe size of 6, you've got about 70% of women with that shoe size of 6. You might have some women with slightly smaller feet of like a 4 or a 5, and some women with a 7 or an 8, but generally sit around the average. What becomes abnormal, however, is if the person falls within those 5% of extremities either side, so the -3 and the 3 here. In that case, you are numerically rare, you are much less common than the rest of the population if your shoe size is a 2 or if your feet are as large as a 10 for a female. So taking that as the example with IQ, which the exam board will credit, the average IQ is around 100, but most people have an IQ ranging of 85 to 115. So that's your average, and that's an acceptable IQ level, if you like, according to this definition. However, 2% will fall below 70, and they would be classified as having an intellectual disability disorder. So they would be diagnosed with an abnormality of intellectual disability disorder, according to this definition, because they have a less common characteristic than the rest of the population. They're numerically rare, so they are abnormal. This is your opportunity to consider some strengths and weaknesses of this definition, and in 5 seconds I will discuss them. So, statistical infrequency is a good definition because it has practical applications. As I've mentioned, it's objective, it relies on numbers, statistics, standard deviation, percentage, etc. And so it has place in clinical diagnosis. I've given the example on the previous slide of intellectual disability disorder, but a really good example for you to use for psychopathology, because you cover depression in the topic, is that the Beck's Depression Inventory, the BDI, was developed on this premise of an assessment tool based on statistical infrequency. So statistical infrequency is very useful. It has practical applications amongst clinicians to diagnose and determine the severity of an individual's symptoms. So it's not only useful just for diagnosis, but also for the severity of a person's symptoms. So going back to the Beck Depression Inventory, someone who scores 30 or more, so is in the top 5% of respondents, would be seen as having and diagnosed with severe depression. So this sort of statistical infrequency way of defining abnormality is massively useful in diagnosing and assessing patients. However, going back to our IQ example, rare characteristics can be positive. Not all rare behaviours are negative. Not all rare behaviours should be considered abnormal and have that stigma attached to them. So for every person with an IQ below 70, if you go back to that normal distribution curve, there's also a person with an IQ above 130. So if we're thinking like Stephen Hawking's, his IQ was 120, I think, or maybe even higher. So he has very high IQ. And we shouldn't, or we don't, consider those individuals with really high IQs as abnormal, or those with a very low depression score as abnormal. So just because you're unusual doesn't make you abnormal. And although statistical infrequency is useful in assessment and diagnosis, it should not be used in isolation. This links very nicely into the final evaluation point for statistical infrequency, and that it has negative implications. So while some people might benefit from being classed as abnormal, being diagnosed with depression or an intellectual disability, means they can access support. But it's this bit here that's the drawback. Not everyone who is statistically unusual would benefit from a label. Labels have really severe, long-lasting consequences, and someone with a low IQ might be able to cope with their lifestyle. So labeling them means you've now attached a stigma to them, and that could limit their life chances by just labeling them as someone with a disability. That then affects how people view them, how they fill out job applications, how they view themselves. So statistical infrequency can have some really negative implications on people, and so we have to be very cautious with that. Moving on to the final definition of deviation from ideal mental health. So this is your final opportunity for definition A01 to pause, have a think about how it defines abnormality, and then you can check if you are correct in 5 seconds' time. So deviation from ideal mental health is the definition created by Mary Jahoda, and she said that abnormality is the absence of criteria for good mental health. So Mary Jahoda came up with criteria of what constitutes good mental health, which can be seen in the purple box below. The reason Jahoda did this is because there was a lot of talk about physical health and physical illness, and it's very easy to identify symptoms of physical illness, body temperature being above or below 37 degrees Celsius, for example. That's very factual. It's very easy to check that with physical health and physical illness. So Jahoda created criteria for good mental health, just like there is for physical health and physical illness. So the important bit here is that it's the absence of the criteria that makes someone abnormal, and the more criteria absent, the more serious the abnormality. So thinking about that in the context of A03, that again allows a diagnosis to be made, but also severity to be assessed. So I use the praise mnemonic to encourage students to learn the 6 criteria of deviation from ideal mental health. You don't necessarily need all 6, but it would be useful to remember at least 3 of them. So a positive attitude towards self, they have high self-esteem, high confidence and beliefs in their ability. They are resistant to stress, so they're able to adapt and overcome and be resilient, that sort of bounce back ability to any downfalls in their life. They have an accurate perception of reality. So that's things like not hearing voices, not believing that because someone has said something bad about your handwriting or your accent, for example, that makes you a terrible person. So being able to interpret information that's given to you in a rational way, I guess. Being independent and having autonomy, so having control over your own behaviour and not relying too much on other people. Self-actualization, this is the same concept that Maslow used in his hierarchy, which is about achieving your full potential. And then environmental mastery, which is things like having healthy relationships, being organised as an individual, all those sorts of things. So this is an opportunity now to pause the video and to think of some strengths and weaknesses of Jahoda's deviation from ideal mental health definition. And in 5 seconds, I will go through the answers. Okay, so deviation from ideal mental health is the only sort of positive definition, certainly more positive than failure to function adequately, because it concentrates on what an individual needs to be healthy. If you think about failure to function adequately, that's what the person is not doing. This one is about what is ideal mental health, what should you have, what criteria should you have, rather than what a person lacks. So it focuses on the whole person through a range of different criteria, and this has implications for treatment. So as I said earlier, it helps to assess the severity, and therefore the therapist can focus on those specific areas with the individual that they might need help with. So it's a strength because it has practical applications, and hopefully you're noticing that sort of golden thread there in evaluation, that most of these definitions, or all, could be argued to be good for practical applications. You've just got to change the way you word what the practical application is. There are cultural differences though. Jahoda's criteria are culturally bound, just like Maslow's concept of self-actualization in the humanistic approach. We can use that same criticism here because it's valued in individualistic cultures, Western culture such as England or America, but certainly not in collectivist cultures, so Asia, China, India, for example. So in certain cultures, marriage is based on the family's values and connections rather than an individual preference. So that's your example to use for how this criteria is culturally bound, because that would mean, according to Mary Jehoda's criteria, that collectivist cultures are abnormal, which is certainly not the case. It's just different. And different does not mean abnormal. So this definition cannot determine what is abnormal universally. And remember, I said previously in the video, the aim of psychology is to create universal definitions of which this is not one. And finally, it's an unrealistic definition. Whilst Jehoda is very positive, her criteria are unrealistic, because on a day-to-day basis, an individual would fail to achieve at least one of these 6 criteria. This could be due to stressful deadlines at work or school. It could be due to a whole host of factors, not because they're abnormal. So it sets an unrealistic high standard for people to meet, and ultimately would classify everyone as abnormal at some point in their life. So it's a very unrealistic and limited definition. So that is deviation from ideal mental health evaluation. On the final slide, I have a summary for you, and I'm just going to go over a few exam skills for this topic to finish. So here we have our recap table of the definitions. This will allow you to sort of identify those golden threads. As I said, you've got your practical application for at least 2 of the definitions, but as I've said, you can use it for all 4 of them. So practical application of the individual's subjective experience, that strength translates across all 4 of your definitions. But I just want to focus on the AO1 key terms, so I'm going to go ahead and underline these in green. When describing deviation from social norms, please use the terms expected behaviour, unwritten rules and society to articulate your point. You'll get marks for your specialist terminology there. For failure to function adequately, it's about an inability to cope. It's about the demands of day-to-day life which the person cannot cope with, and the maladaptive behaviour that they display. And you can use those examples: no interpersonal skills, observer distress, personal distress, etc. For statistical infrequency, use the term numerically rare and refer to the normal distribution curve to show the examiner you've got that synoptic knowledge. And then finally, for deviation from ideal mental health, refer to the fact that it's the absence of Jehoda's criteria that makes someone abnormal, and the more criteria that is absent, the more abnormal an individual is. So I'll leave that on display for a short moment, just so hopefully you can make those links between each of the definitions. And that is the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful.